Chapter 6 of the Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 6. In the Heart of the Oak Grove. We reached the chateau, and, as we approached it, saw four gendarmes pacing in front of a little door in the ground floor of the donjon. We soon learned that in this ground floor, which had formerly served as a prison, Monsieur and Madame Bernier, the concierges, were confined. Monsieur Robert Darzac led us into the modern part of the chateau by a large door, protected by a projecting awning, a marquise, as it is called. Rouletabille, who had resigned the horse and the cab to the care of the servant, never took his eyes off Monsieur Darzac. I followed his look, and perceived that it was directed solely towards the gloved hands of the Sorbonne professor. When we were in a tiny sitting-room fitted with old furniture, Monsieur Darzac turned to Rouletabille and said sharply, "What do you want?" The reporter answered, in an equally sharp tone, "To shake you by the hand." Darzac shrank back. What does that mean? Evidently he understood. What I also understood, that my friend suspected him of the abominable attempt on the life of Mademoiselle Stangerson. The impression of the blood-stained hand on the walls of the Yellow Room was in his mind. I looked at the man closely. His haughty face, with its expression ordinarily so straightforward, was at this moment strangely troubled. He held out his right hand, and referring to me, said, "As you are a friend of Monsieur Sainclair, who has rendered me invaluable services in a just cause, monsieur, I see no reason for refusing you my hand." Rouletabille did not take the extended hand. Lying with the utmost audacity, he said, "Monsieur, I have lived several years in Russia, where I have acquired the habit of never taking any but an ungloved hand." I thought that the Sorbonne professor would express his anger openly, but on the contrary, by a visibly violent effort, he calmed himself, took off his gloves, and showed his hands. They were unmarked by any cicatrix. "Are you satisfied?" "No," replied Rouletabille. "My dear friend," he said, turning to me, "I am obliged to ask you to leave us alone for a moment." I bowed and retired, stupefied by what I had seen and heard. I could not understand why Monsieur Robert Darzac had not already shown the door to my impertinent, insulting, and stupid friend. I was angry myself with Rouletabille at that moment for his suspicions, which had led to this scene of the gloves. For some 20 minutes I walked about in front of the chateau, trying vainly to link together the different events of the day. What was in Rouletabille's mind? Was it possible that he thought Monsieur Robert Darzac to be the murderer? How could it be thought that this man, who was to have married Mademoiselle Stangerson in the course of a few days, had introduced himself into the Yellow Room to assassinate his fiancée? I could find no explanation as to how the murderer had been able to leave the Yellow Room, and so long as that mystery, which appeared to me so inexplicable, remained unexplained, I thought it was the duty of all of us to refrain from suspecting anybody. But then, that seemingly senseless phrase, "The presbytery has lost nothing of its charm, nor the garden its brightness," still rang in my ears. What did it mean? I was eager to rejoin Rouletabille and question him. At that moment the young man came out of the chateau in the company of Monsieur Robert Darzac, and, extraordinary to relate, I saw, at a glance, that they were the best of friends. "We are going to the Yellow Room. Come with us," Rouletabille said to me. "You know, my dear boy, I am going to keep you with me all day. We'll breakfast together somewhere about here." You'll breakfast with me here, gentlemen." "No, thanks," replied the young man. "We shall breakfast at the Donjon Inn." "You'll fare very badly there. You'll not find anything." "Do you think so? Well, I hope to find something there," replied Rouletabille. "After breakfast we'll set to work again. I'll write my article, and if you'll be so good as to take it to the office for me—" "Won't you come back with me to Paris?" "No, I shall remain here." I turned towards Rouletabille. He spoke quite seriously, and Monsieur Robert Darzac did not appear to be in the least degree surprised. We were passing by the donjon and heard wailing voices. Rouletabille asked: "Why have these people been arrested?" "It is a little my fault," said Monsieur Darzac. "I happened to remark to the examining magistrate yesterday that it was inexplicable that the concierges had had time to hear the revolver shots, to dress themselves, and to cover so great a distance as that which lies between their lodge and the pavilion, in the space of 2 minutes, for not more than that interval of time had elapsed after the firing of the shots when they were met by Daddy Jacques." "That was suspicious, evidently," acquiesced Rouletabille. "And were they dressed?" "That is what is so incredible. They were dressed, completely, not one part of their costume wanting. The woman wore sabots, but the man had unlaced boots. Now they assert that they went to bed at 9:30. On arriving this morning, the examining magistrate brought with him from Paris a revolver of the same calibre as that found in the room, for he couldn't use the one held for evidence, and made his Register fire 2 shots in "The Yellow Room" while the doors and windows were closed. We were with him in the lodge of the concierges, and yet we heard nothing, not a sound. The concierges have lied, of that there can be no doubt. They must have been already waiting, not far from the pavilion, waiting for something. Certainly they are not to be accused of being the authors of the crime, but their complicity is not improbable. That was why Monsieur de Marquet had them arrested at once." "If they had been accomplices," said Rouletabille, "they would not have been there at all. When people throw themselves into the arms of justice with the proofs of complicity on them, you can be sure they are not accomplices. I don't believe there are any accomplices in this affair." "Then why were they abroad at midnight? Why don't they say?" "They have certainly some reason for their silence. What that reason is has to be found out, for even if they are not accomplices, it may be of importance. Everything that took place on such a night is important." We had crossed an old bridge thrown over the Douve, and were entering the part of the park called the Oak Grove. The oaks here were centuries old. Autumn had already shriveled their tawny leaves, and their high branches, black and contorted, looked like horrid heads of hair, mingled with quaint reptiles such as the ancient sculptors might have made of the head of Medusa. This place, which Mademoiselle found cheerful, and in which she lived in the summer season, appeared to us as sad and funereal now. The soil was black and muddy from the recent rains and the rotting of the fallen leaves. The trunks of the trees were black, and the sky above us was now, as if in mourning, charged with great heavy clouds. And it was in this sombre and desolate retreat that we saw the white walls of the pavilion as we approached, a queer-looking building without a window visible on the side by which we neared it. A little door alone marked the entrance to it. It might have passed for a tomb, a vast mausoleum in the midst of a thick forest. As we came nearer, we were able to make out its disposition. The building obtained all the light it needed from the south, that is to say, from the open country. The little door closed on the park. Monsieur and Mademoiselle Stangerson must have found it an ideal seclusion for their work and their dreams. The pavilion had a ground floor which was reached by a few steps, and above it was an attic, with which we need not concern ourselves. Rouletabille had drawn a plan of the building, showing "The Yellow Room," with its one window and its one door opening into the laboratory; the laboratory, with its two large barred windows and its doors, one serving for the vestibule, the other for "The Yellow Room"; the vestibule, with its unbarred window and door opening into the park; the lavatory, the stairs leading to the attic, and the large and only chimney in the pavilion, serving for the experiments of the laboratory. I assured myself that there was not a line in this plan that was wanting to help to the solution of the problem then set before the police. Thus my readers will know as much as Rouletabille knew when he entered the pavilion for the first time. With him, they may now ask, how did the murderer escape from "The Yellow Room"? Before mounting the 3 steps leading up to the door of the pavilion, Rouletabille stopped and asked Monsieur Darzac point blank, "What was the motive for the crime?" "Speaking for myself, monsieur, there can be no doubt on the matter," said Mademoiselle Stangerson's fiancé, greatly distressed. "The nails of the fingers, the deep scratches on the chest and throat of Mademoiselle Stangerson showed that the wretch who attacked her attempted to commit a frightful crime. The medical expert who examined these traces yesterday affirmed that they were made by the same hand as that which left its imprint on the wall. An enormous hand, monsieur, much too large to go into my glove," he added, with an indefinable smile. "Could not that blood-stained hand," I interrupted, "have been the hand of Mademoiselle Stangerson, who, in the moment of falling, had pressed it against the wall, and, in slipping, enlarged the impression?" "There was not a drop of blood on either of her hands when she was lifted up," replied Monsieur Darzac. "We are now sure," said I, "that it was Mademoiselle Stangerson who was armed with Daddy Jacques' revolver, since she wounded the hand of the murderer. She was in fear, then, of somebody or something." "Probably." "Do you suspect anybody?" "No," replied Monsieur Darzac, looking at Rouletabille. Rouletabille then said to me: "You must know, my friend, that the inquiry is a little more advanced than Monsieur de Marquet has chosen to tell us. He not only knows that Mademoiselle Stangerson defended herself with the revolver, but he knows what the weapon was that was used to attack her. Monsieur Darzac tells me it was a mutton bone. Why is Monsieur de Marquet surrounding this mutton bone with so much mystery? No doubt for the purpose of facilitating the inquiries of the agents of the Sûreté. He imagines, perhaps, that the owner of this instrument of crime, the most terrible invented, is going to be found amongst those who are well known in the slums of Paris who use it. But who can ever say what passes through the brain of an examining magistrate?" Rouletabille added, with contemptuous irony: "Has a mutton bone been found in "The Yellow Room"?" I asked him. "Yes, monsieur," said Robert Darzac, "at the foot of the bed. But I beg of you not to say anything about it." I made a gesture of assent. "It was an enormous mutton bone, the top of which, or rather the joint, was still red with the blood of the frightful wound. It was an old bone, which may, according to appearances, have served in other crimes. That's what Monsieur de Marquet thinks. He has had it sent to the municipal laboratory at Paris to be analyzed. In fact, he thinks he has detected on it not only the blood of the last victim, but other stains of dried blood, evidences of previous crimes." "A mutton bone in the hand of a skilled assassin is a frightful weapon," said Rouletabille. "A more certain weapon than a heavy hammer." "The scoundrel has proved it to be so," said Monsieur Robert Darzac, sadly. "The joint of the bone found exactly fits the wound inflicted." "My belief is that the wound would have been mortal if the murderer's blow had not been arrested in the act by Mademoiselle Stangerson's revolver. Wounded in the hand, he dropped the mutton bone and fled. Unfortunately, the blow had been already given, and Mademoiselle was stunned after having been nearly strangled. If she had succeeded in wounding the man with the first shot of the revolver, she would, doubtless, have escaped the blow with the bone. But she had certainly employed her revolver too late. The first shot deviated and lodged in the ceiling. It was the second only that took effect. Having said this, Monsieur Darzac knocked at the door of the pavilion. I must confess to feeling a strong impatience to reach the spot where the crime had been committed. It was some time before the door was opened by a man whom I at once recognized as Daddy Jacques. He appeared to be well over 60 years of age. He had a long white beard and white hair, on which he wore a flat Basque cap. He was dressed in a complete suit of chestnut-colored velveteen, worn at the sides. Sabots were on his feet. He had rather a waspish-looking face, the expression of which lightened, however, as soon as he saw Monsieur Darzac. "Friends," said our guide. "Nobody in the pavilion, Daddy Jacques?" "I ought not to allow anybody to enter, Monsieur Robert, but of course the order does not apply to you. These gentlemen of justice have seen everything there is to be seen, and made enough drawings, and drawn up enough reports." "Excuse me, Daddy Jacques, one question before anything else," said Rouletabille. "What is it, young man, if I can answer it? Did your mistress wear her hair in bands that evening? You know what I mean, over her forehead?" "No, young man, my mistress never wore her hair in the way you suggest, neither on that day nor on any other. She had her hair drawn up, as usual, so that her beautiful forehead could be seen, pure as that of an unborn child." Rouletabille grunted, and set to work examining the door, finding that it fastened itself automatically. He satisfied himself that it could never remain open, and needed a key to open it. Then we entered the vestibule, a small, well-lit room paved with square red tiles. "Ah, this is the window by which the murderer escaped," said Rouletabille. "So they keep on saying, monsieur, so they keep on saying. But if he had gone off that way, we should have been sure to have seen him. We are not blind, neither Monsieur Stangerson nor me, nor the concierges who are in the prison. Why have they not put me in prison, too, on account of my revolver?" Rouletabille had already opened the window and was examining the shutters. "Were these closed at the time of the crime?" "And fastened with the iron catch inside," said Daddy Jacques, "and I am quite sure that the murderer did not get out that way." "Are there any bloodstains?" "Yes, on the stones outside." "But blood of what?" "Ah!" said Rouletabille, "there are footmarks visible on the path. The ground was very moist. I will look into that presently." "Nonsense!" interrupted Daddy Jacques. "The murderer did not go that way." "Which way did he go, then?" "How do I know?" Rouletabille looked at everything, smelled everything. He went down on his knees and rapidly examined every one of the paving tiles. Daddy Jacques went on: "Ah, you can't find anything, monsieur. Nothing has been found, and now it is all dirty. Too many persons have tramped over it. They wouldn't let me wash it, but on the day of the crime I had washed the floor thoroughly, and if the murderer had crossed it with his hobnailed boots, I should not have failed to see where he had been. He has left marks enough in Mademoiselle's chamber." Rouletabille rose. "When was the last time you washed these tiles?" he asked. And he fixed on Daddy Jacques a most searching look. "Why, as I told you, on the day of the crime, towards 5:30, while Mademoiselle and her father were taking a little walk before dinner, here in this room. They had dined in the laboratory. The next day, the examining magistrate came and saw all the marks there were on the floor, as plainly as if they had been made with ink on white paper, while neither in the laboratory nor in the vestibule, which were both as clean as a new pin, were there any traces of a man's footmarks. Since they have been found near this window outside, he must have made his way through the ceiling of "The Yellow Room" into the attic, then cut his way through the roof and dropped to the ground outside the vestibule window. But there's no hole, neither in the ceiling of "The Yellow Room" nor in the room of my attic. That is absolutely certain. So you see, we know nothing, nothing, and nothing will ever be known. It's a mystery of the devil's own making." Rouletabille went down upon his knees again, almost in front of a small lavatory at the back of the vestibule. In that position he remained for about a minute. "Well?" I asked him when he got up. "Oh, nothing very important. A drop of blood," he replied, turning towards Daddy Jacques as he spoke. "While you were washing the laboratory and this vestibule, was the vestibule window open?" he asked. "No, monsieur, it was closed. But after I had done washing the floor, I lit some charcoal for monsieur in the laboratory furnace, and as I lit it with old newspapers, it smoked, and so I opened both the windows in the laboratory and this one, to make a current of air. Then I shut those in the laboratory, and left this one open when I went out. When I returned to the pavilion, this window had been closed and Monsieur and Mademoiselle were already at work in the laboratory. Monsieur or Mademoiselle Stangerson had no doubt shut it." "No doubt." "You did not ask them?" After a close scrutiny of the little lavatory and of the staircase leading up to the attic, Rouletabille, to whom we seemed no longer to exist, entered the laboratory. I followed him. It was, I confess, in a state of great excitement. Robert Darzac lost none of my friend's movements. As for me, my eyes were drawn at once to the door of "The Yellow Room." It was closed, and, as I immediately saw, partially shattered and out of commission. My friend, who went about his work methodically, silently studied the room in which we were. It was large and well lighted. Two big windows, almost bays, were protected by strong iron bars, and looked out upon a wide extent of country. Through an opening in the forest, they commanded a wonderful view through the length of the valley and across the plain to the large town, which could be clearly seen in fair weather. To-day, however, a mist hung over the ground, and blood in that room! The whole of the side of the laboratory was taken up with a large chimney, crucibles, ovens, and such implements as are needed for chemical experiments; tables loaded with files, papers, reports, and electrical machine, an apparatus, as Monsieur Darzac informed me, employed by Professor Stangerson to demonstrate the dissociation of matter under the action of solar light, and other scientific implements. Along the walls were cabinets, plain or glass fronted, through which were visible microscopes, special photographic apparatus, and a large quantity of crystals. Rouletabille, who was ferreting in the chimney, put his fingers into one of the crucibles. Suddenly he drew himself up and held up a piece of half-consumed paper in his hand. He stepped up to where we were talking by one of the windows. "Keep that for us, Monsieur Darzac," he said. I bent over the piece of scorched paper which Monsieur Darzac took from the hand of Rouletabille, and read distinctly the only words that remained legible: "Presbytery lost nothing, charm, nor the gar, its brightness." Twice since the morning these same meaningless words had struck me, and for the second time I saw that they produced on the Sorbonne professor the same paralyzing effect. Monsieur Darzac's first anxiety showed itself when he turned his eyes in the direction of Daddy Jacques. But, occupied as he was at another window, he had seen nothing. Then, trembling, opening his pocket-book, he put the piece of paper into it, sighing, "My God!" During this time, Rouletabille had mounted into the opening of the fire-grate; that is to say, he had got upon the bricks of a furnace, and was attentively examining the chimney, which grew narrower towards the top, the outlet from it being closed with sheets of iron, fastened into the brickwork, through which passed three small chimneys. "Impossible to get out that way," he said, jumping back into the laboratory. "Besides, even if he had tried to do it, he would have brought all that ironwork down to the ground. No, no, it is not on that side we have to search." Rouletabille next examined the furniture, and opened the doors of the cabinet. Then he came to the windows, through which he declared no one could possibly have passed. At the second window he found Daddy Jacques in contemplation. "Well, Daddy Jacques," he said, "what are you looking at?" "That policeman who is always going round and round the lake. Another of those fellows who think they can see better than anybody else." "You don't know Frederic Larsan, Daddy Jacques, or you wouldn't speak of him in that way," said Rouletabille, in a melancholy tone. "If there is anyone who will find the murderer, it will be he." And Rouletabille heaved a deep sigh. "Before they find him, they will have to learn how they lost him," said Daddy Jacques, stolidly. At length we reached the door of "The Yellow Room" itself. "There is the door behind which some terrible scene took place," said Rouletabille, with a solemnity which, under any other circumstance, would have been comical. Chapter 7
of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stuart Bell. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 7, in which Rouletabille sets out on an expedition under the bed. Rouletabille, having pushed open the door of The Yellow Room, paused on the threshold, saying with an emotion which I only later understood, "Ah, the perfume of the lady in black." The chamber was dark. Daddy Jacques was about to open the blinds when Rouletabille stopped him. "Did not the tragedy take place in complete darkness?" he asked. "No, young man, I don't think so. Mademoiselle always had a night light on her table, and I lit it every evening before she went to bed. I was a sort of chambermaid, you must understand, when the evening came. The real chambermaid did not come in here much before the morning. Mademoiselle worked late, far into the night." "Where did the table with the night light stand? Far from the bed?" "Some way from the bed." "Can you light the burner now?" "The lamp is broken, and the oil that was in it was spilled when the table was upset. All the rest of the things in the room remain just as they were. I have only to open the blinds for you to see. Wait." Rouletabille went back into the laboratory, closed the shutters of the two windows and the door of the vestibule. When we were in complete darkness, he lit a wax vesta and asked Daddy Jacques to move to the middle of the chamber with it, to the place where the night light was burning that night. Daddy Jacques, who was in his stockings, he usually left his sabot in the vestibule, entered The Yellow Room with his bit of a vesta. We vaguely distinguished objects overthrown on the floor, a bed in one corner, and, in front of us, to the left, the gleam of a looking-glass hanging on the wall near to the bed. "That will do. You may now open the blinds," said Rouletabille. "Don't come any further," Daddy Jacques begged. You may make marks with your boots, and nothing must be deranged. It's an idea of the magistrate's, though he has nothing more to do here." And he pushed open the shutter. The pale daylight entered from without, throwing a sinister light on the saffron-coloured walls. The floor, for though the laboratory and the vestibule were tiled, the yellow room had a flooring of wood, was covered with a single yellow mat, which was large enough to cover nearly the whole room, under the bed and under the dressing-table, the only piece of furniture that remained upright. The centre round table, the night-table, and 2 chairs had been overturned. These did not prevent a large stain of blood being visible on the mat, made, as Daddy Jacques informed us, by the blood which had flowed from the wound on Mademoiselle Stangerson's forehead. Besides these stains, drops of blood had fallen in all directions, in line with the visible traces of the footsteps, large and black, of the murderer. Everything led to the presumption that these drops of blood had fallen from the wound of the man who had, for a moment, placed his red hand on the wall. There were other traces of the same hand on the wall, but much less distinct. "See this blood on the wall!" I could not help exclaiming. "The man who pressed his hand so heavily upon it in the darkness must certainly have thought that he was pushing at a door. That's why he pressed on it so hard, leaving on the yellow paper the terrible evidence. I don't think there are many hands in the world of that sort. It's big and strong, and the fingers are nearly all one as long as the other. The thumb is wanting, and we only have the mark of the palm. But if we follow the trace of the hand," I continued, "we see that, after leaving its imprint in the wall, the touch sought the door, found it, and then felt for the lock." "No doubt," interrupted Rouletabille, chuckling, "only there is no blood, either on the lock or on the bolt." "What does that prove?" I rejoined, with a good sense of which I was proud. "He might have opened the lock with his left hand, which would have been quite natural, his right hand being wounded." "He didn't open it at all!" Daddy Jacques again exclaimed. "We are not fools, and there were 4 of us when we burst open the door." "What a queer hand! Look what a queer hand it is!" I said. "It is a very natural hand," said Rouletabille, "of which the shape has been deformed by its having slipped on the wall. The man dried his hand on the wall. He must be a man about 5'8" in height." "How do you come at that?" "By the height of the marks on the wall." My friend next occupied himself with the mark of the bullet in the wall. It was a round hole. "This ball was fired straight, not from above, and consequently not from below." Rouletabille went back to the door and carefully examined the lock and the bolt, satisfying himself that the door had certainly been burst open from the outside, and further that the key had been found in the lock on the inside of the chamber. He finally satisfied himself that, with the key in the lock, the door could not possibly be opened from without with another key. Having made sure of all these details, he let fall these words: "That's better." Then, sitting down on the ground, he hastily took off his boots, and, in his socks, went into the room. The first thing he did was to examine minutely the overturned furniture. We watched him in silence. "Young fellow, you are giving yourself a great deal of trouble," said Daddy Jacques ironically. Rouletabille raised his head and said: "You have spoken the simple truth, Daddy Jacques. Your mistress did not have her hair in bands that evening. I was a donkey to have believed she did." Then, with the suppleness of a serpent, he slipped under the bed. Presently we heard him ask: "At what time, Monsieur Jacques, did Monsieur and Mademoiselle Stangerson arrive at the laboratory?" "At 6 o'clock." The voice of Rouletabille continued: "Yes, he's been under here, that's certain. In fact, there was nowhere else where he could have hidden himself. Here, too, are the marks of his hobnails. When you entered, all 4 of you, did you look under the bed?" "At once. We drew it right out of its place." "And between the mattresses?" "There was only one on the bed, and on that Mademoiselle was placed, and Monsieur Stangerson and the concierge immediately carried it into the laboratory. Under the mattress there was nothing but the metal netting, which could not conceal anything or anybody. Remember, monsieur, that there were 4 of us, and we couldn't fail to see everything. The chamber is so small and scantily furnished, and all was locked behind in the pavilion." I ventured an hypothesis. Perhaps he got away with the mattress, in the mattress. Anything is possible in the face of such a mystery. In their distress of mind, Monsieur Stangerson and the concierge may not have noticed that they were bearing a double weight, especially if the concierge were an accomplice. I throw out this hypothesis for what it's worth, but it explains many things, and particularly the fact that neither the laboratory nor the vestibule bear any traces of the footmarks found in the room. If, in carrying Mademoiselle on the mattress from the laboratory of the chateau, they rested for a moment, then there might have been an opportunity for the man in it to escape. "And then?" asked Rouletabille, deliberately laughing under the bed. I felt rather vexed, and replied, "Well, I don't know, but anything appears possible." "The examining magistrate had the same idea, monsieur," said Daddy Jacques, "and he carefully examined the mattress. He was obliged to laugh at the idea, monsieur, as your friend is doing now, for who ever heard of a mattress having a double bottom?" I was myself obliged to laugh, on seeing that what I had said was absurd. But in an affair like this one hardly knows where an absurdity begins or ends. My friend alone seemed able to talk intelligently. He called out from under the bed: "The mat here has been moved out of place. Who did it?" "We did, monsieur," explained Daddy Jacques. "When we could not find the assassin, we asked ourselves whether there was not some hole in the floor." "There is not," replied Rouletabille. "Is there a cellar?" "No, there's no cellar, but that has not stopped our searching, and has not prevented the examining magistrate and his registrar from studying the floor plank by plank, as if there had been a cellar under it." The reporter then reappeared. His eyes were sparkling and his nostrils quivered. He remained on his hands and knees. He could not be better likened than to an admirable sporting dog on the scent of some unusual game. And indeed he was scenting the steps of a man, the man whom he had sworn to report to his master, the manager of the "Epoque." It must not be forgotten that Rouletabille was first and last a journalist. Thus, on his hands and knees, he made his way to the 4 corners of the room, so to speak, sniffing and going around everything, everything that we could see, which was not much, and everything that we could not see, which must have been infinite. The toilette table was a simple table standing on 4 legs. There was nothing about it by which it could possibly be changed into a temporary hiding place. There was not a closet or cupboard. Mademoiselle Stangerson kept her wardrobe at the chateau. Rouletabille literally passed his nose and hands along the walls, constructed of solid brickwork. When he had finished with the walls, and passed his agile fingers over every portion of the yellow paper covering them, he reached to the ceiling, which he was able to touch by mounting on a chair placed on the toilette table, and by moving this ingeniously constructed stage from place to place, he examined every foot of it. When he had finished his scrutiny of the ceiling, where he carefully examined the hole made by the second bullet, he approached the window, and once more examined the iron bars and blinds, all of which were solid and intact. At last he gave a grunt of satisfaction, and declared, "Now I am at ease." "Well, do you believe that the poor dear young lady was shut up when she was being murdered, when she cried out for help?" wailed Daddy Jacques. "Yes," said the young reporter, drying his forehead. "The Yellow Room was as tightly shut as an iron safe." "That," I said, "is why this mystery is the most surprising I know. Edgar Allan Poe, in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, invented nothing like it. The place of that crime was sufficiently closed to prevent the escape of a man, but there was that window through which the monkey, the perpetrator of the murder, could slip away. But here there can be no question of an opening of any sort. The door was fastened, and through the window blinds, secure as they were, not even a fly could enter or get out." "True, true," assented Rouletabille, as he kept on drying his forehead, which seemed to be perspiring less from his recent bodily exertion than from his mental agitation. "Indeed, it's a beautiful and a very curious mystery." "The Bête de bon Dieu," muttered Daddy Jacques. "The Bête de bon Dieu herself, if she had committed the crime, could not have escaped. Listen! Do you hear it? Hush!" Daddy Jacques made us a sign to keep quiet, and, stretching his arm towards the wall nearest the forest, listened to something which we could not hear. "It's answering," he said at length. "I must kill it. It is too wicked, but it's the Bête de bon Dieu, and every night it goes to pray on the tomb of Sainte Geneviève, and nobody dares to touch her, for fear that Mother Angenoux should cast an evil spell on them." "How big is the Bête de bon Dieu?" "Nearly as big as a small retriever. A monster, I tell you. Ah, I have asked myself more than once whether it was not her that took out our poor mademoiselle by the throat with her claws. But the Bête de bon Dieu does not wear hobnailed boots, nor fire revolvers, nor has she a hand like that," exclaimed Daddy Jacques, again pointing out to us the red mark on the wall. "Besides, we should have seen her as well as we would have seen a man." Evidently, I said, before we had seen this yellow room, I had also asked myself whether the cat of Mother Angenoux— "You also?" cried Rouletabille. "Didn't you?" I asked. "Not for a moment. After reading the article in the Matin, I knew that a cat had nothing to do with the matter. But I swear now that a frightful tragedy has been enacted here. You say nothing about the Basque cap or the handkerchief found here, Daddy Jacques?" "Of course the magistrate has taken them," the old man answered, hesitatingly. "I haven't seen either the handkerchief or the cap, yet I can tell you how they are made," the reporter said to him gravely. "Oh, you are very clever," said Daddy Jacques, coughing and embarrassed. "The handkerchief is a large one, blue with red stripes, and the cap is an old Basque cap like the one you're wearing now." "You are quite a wizard," said Daddy Jacques, trying not to laugh, and not quite succeeding. "How do you know that the handkerchief is blue with red stripes?" "Because if it had not been blue with red stripes, it would not have been found at all." Without giving any further attention to Daddy Jacques, my friend took a piece of paper from his pocket, and taking out a pair of scissors, bent over the footprints. Placing the paper over one of them, he began to cut. In a short time he had made a perfect pattern, which he handed to me, begging me not to lose it. He then returned to the window, and pointing to the figure of Frederic Larsan, who had not quitted the side of the lake, asked Daddy Jacques whether the detective had, like himself, been working in the Yellow Room. "No," replied Robert Darzac, who, since Rouletabille had handed him the piece of scorched paper, had not uttered a word. "He pretends that he does not need to examine the Yellow Room. He says that the murderer made his escape from it in quite a natural way, and that he will, this evening, explain how he did it." As he listened to what Monsieur Darzac had to say, Rouletabille turned pale. "Has Frederic Larsan found out the truth, which I can only guess at?" he murmured. "He is very clever, and I admire him. But what we have to do today is something more than the work of a policeman, something quite different from the teachings of experience. We have to take hold of our reason by the right end." The reporter rushed into the open air, agitated by the thought that the great and famous Fred might anticipate him in the solution of the problem of the Yellow Room. I managed to reach him on the threshold of the pavilion. "Calm yourself, my dear fellow," I said. "Aren't you satisfied?" "Yes," he confessed to me with a deep sigh. "I am quite satisfied. I have discovered many things." "Moral or material?" "Several moral, one material. This, for example." And rapidly he drew from his waistcoat pocket a piece of paper in which he had placed a light-coloured hair from a woman's head. End of chapter 7. Recording by Stuart Bell, Cambridge, UK.
Chapter 8 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 8. The examining magistrate questions Mademoiselle Stangerson. 2 minutes later, as Rouletabille was bending over the footprints discovered in the park under the window of the vestibule, a man, evidently a servant at the chateau, came towards us rapidly and called out to Monsieur Darzac, then coming out of the pavilion. Monsieur Robert, the magistrate, you know, is questioning mademoiselle. Monsieur Darzac added a muttered excuse to us and set off running toward the chateau, the man running after him. If the corpse can speak, I said, it would be interesting to be there. We must know, said my friend. Let's go to the chateau. And he drew me with him. But at the chateau, a gendarme placed in the vestibule denied us admission up the staircase of the first floor. We were obliged to wait downstairs. This is what passed in the chamber of the victim while we were waiting below. The family doctor, finding that Mademoiselle Stangerson was much better, but fearing a relapse which would no longer permit of her being questioned, had thought it his duty to inform the examining magistrate of this, who decided to proceed immediately with a brief examination. At this examination the register, Monsieur Stangerson, and the doctor were present. Later I obtained the text of the report of the examination, and I give it here in all its legal dryness. Question. Are you able, mademoiselle, without too much fatiguing yourself, to give some necessary details of the frightful attack of which you have been the victim? Answer. I feel much better, monsieur, and I will tell you all I know. When I entered my chamber, I did not notice anything unusual there. Question. Excuse me, mademoiselle. If you will allow me, I will ask you some questions, and you will answer them. That will fatigue you less than making a long recital. Answer. Do so, monsieur. Question. What did you do on that day? I want you to be as minute and precise as possible. I wish to know all you did that day, if it is not asking too much of you. Answer. I rose late at 10 o'clock, for my father and I had returned home late on the night previously, having been to dinner at the reception given by the President of the Republic in honor of the Academy of Science of Philadelphia. When I left my chamber at 10:30, my father was already at work in the laboratory. We worked together till midday. We then took half an hour's walk in the park, as we were accustomed to do, before breakfasting at the chateau. After breakfast we took another walk for half an hour, and then returned to the laboratory. There we found my chambermaid, who had come to set my room in order. I went into the yellow room to give her some slight orders, and she directly afterwards left the pavilion, and I resumed my work with my father. At 5 o'clock we went again for a walk in the park, and afterward had tea. Question. Before leaving the pavilion at 5 o'clock, did you go into your chamber? Answer. No, monsieur. My father went into it at my request to bring my hat. Question. And he found nothing suspicious there? Answer. Evidently no, monsieur. Question. It is then almost certain that the murderer was not yet concealed under the bed. When you went out, was the door of the room locked? Answer. No, there was no reason for locking it. Question. You were absent from the pavilion some length of time, Monsieur Stangerson and you? Answer. About an hour. Question. It was during that hour, no doubt, that the murderer got into the pavilion. But how? Nobody knows. Footmarks have been found in the park, leading away from the window of the vestibule, but none has been found going towards it. Did you notice whether the vestibule window was open when you went out? Answer. No, monsieur, I don't remember. Monsieur Stangerson. It was closed. Question. And when you returned? Mademoiselle Stangerson. I did not notice. Monsieur Stangerson. It was still closed. I remember remarking aloud. Daddy Jacques must have opened it while we were away. Question. Strange. Do you recollect, Monsieur Stangerson, if during your absence and before going out he had opened it? You returned to the laboratory at 6 o'clock and resumed work? Mademoiselle Stangerson. Yes, monsieur. Question. And you did not leave the laboratory from that hour up until the moment when you entered your chamber? Monsieur Stangerson. Neither my daughter nor I, monsieur. We were engaged on work that was pressing, and we lost not a moment, neglecting everything else on that account. Question. Did you dine in the laboratory? Answer. For that reason. Question. Are you accustomed to dine in the laboratory? Answer. We rarely dine there. Question. Could the murderer have known that you would dine there that evening? Monsieur Stangerson. Good heavens, I think not. It was only when we returned to the pavilion at 6 o'clock that we decided, my daughter and I, to dine there. At that moment I was spoken to by my gamekeeper, who detained me a moment to ask me to accompany him on an urgent tour of inspection in a part of the woods which I had decided to thin. I put this off until the next day, and begged him, as he was going by the chateau, to tell the steward that we should dine in the laboratory. He left me to execute the errand, and I rejoined my daughter, who was already at work. Question. At what hour, mademoiselle, did you go to your chamber while your father continued to work there? Answer. At midnight. Question. Did Daddy Jacques enter the yellow room in the course of the evening? Answer. To shut the blinds and light the night light. Question. He saw nothing suspicious? Answer. He would have told us if he had seen. Daddy Jacques is an honest man and very attached to me. Question. You affirm, Monsieur Stangerson, that Daddy Jacques remained with you all the time you were in the laboratory? Monsieur Stangerson. I am sure of it. I have no doubt of that. Question. When you entered your chamber, mademoiselle, you immediately shut the door and locked and bolted it? That was taking unusual precautions, knowing that your father and your servant were there. Were you in fear of something then? Answer. My father would be returning to the chateau, and Daddy Jacques would be going to his bed, and in fact I did fear something. Question. You were so much in fear of something that you borrowed Daddy Jacques' revolver without telling him you had done so? Answer. That is true. I did not wish to alarm anybody, the more because my fears might have proved to be foolish. Question. What was it you feared? Answer. I hardly know how to tell you. For several nights I seemed to hear, both in the park and out of the park, round the pavilion, unusual sounds, sometimes footsteps, at other times the cracking of branches. The night before the attack on me, when I did not get to bed before 3 o'clock in the morning, on our return from the Elysee, I stood for a moment before my window, and I felt sure I saw shadows. Question. How many? Answer. 2. They moved around the lake. Then the moon became clouded, and I lost sight of them. At this time of the season, every year, I have generally returned to my apartment at the chateau for the winter. But this year I said to myself that I would not quit the pavilion before my father had finished the résumé of his works on the dissociation of matter for the Academy. I did not wish that that important work, which was to have been finished in the course of a few days, should be delayed by a change in our daily habit. You can well understand that I did not wish to speak of my childish fears to my father, nor did I say anything to Daddy Jacques, who I knew would not have been able to hold his tongue. Knowing that he had a revolver in his room, I took advantage of his absence and borrowed it, placing it on the drawer of my note-table. Question. You know of no enemies you have? Answer. None. Question. You understand, mademoiselle, that these precautions are calculated to cause surprise? Monsieur Stangerson. Evidently, my child, such precautions are very surprising. Answer. No, because I have told you that I had been uneasy for 2 nights. Monsieur Stangerson. You ought to have told me of that. This misfortune would have been avoided. Question. The door of the yellow room locked, did you go to bed? Answer. Yes, and being very tired, I at once went to sleep. Question. The night light was still burning? Answer: Yes, but it gave a very feeble light. Question: Then, mademoiselle, tell us what happened. Answer: I do not know whether I had been long asleep, but suddenly I awoke and uttered a loud cry. Monsieur Stangerson: Yes, a horrible cry, murder. It still rings in my ears. Question: You uttered a loud cry? Answer: A man was in my chamber. He sprang at me and tried to strangle me. I was nearly stifled when suddenly I was able to reach the drawer of my night table and grasp the revolver which I had placed in it. At that moment the man had forced me to the foot of my bed and brandished in over my head a sort of mace, but I had fired. He immediately struck a terrible blow at my head. All that, monsieur, passed more rapidly than I can tell it, and I know nothing more. Question: Nothing? Have you no idea as to how the assassin could escape from your chamber? Answer: None whatever. I know nothing more. One does not know what is passing around one when one is unconscious. Question: Was the man you saw tall or short, little or big? Answer: I only saw a shadow, which appeared to me formidable. Question: You cannot give us any indication? Answer: I know nothing more, monsieur, than that a man threw himself upon me and that I fired at him. I know nothing more. Here the interrogation of Mademoiselle Stangerson concluded. Rouletabille waited patiently for Monsieur Robert Darzac, who soon appeared. From a room near the chamber of Mademoiselle Stangerson he had heard the interrogatory and now came to recount it to my friends with great exactitude, aided by an excellent memory. His docility still surprised me. Thanks to hasty pencil notes, he was able to reproduce, almost textually, the questions and answers given. It looked as if Monsieur Darzac was being employed as the secretary of my young friend, and acted as if he could refuse him nothing, nay, more, as if under a compulsion to do so. The fact of the closed window struck the reporter as it had struck the magistrate. Rouletabille asked Darzac to repeat once more Mademoiselle Stangerson's account of how she and her father had spent the day on the time of the tragedy, as she had stated it to the magistrate. The circumstance of the dinner in the laboratory seemed to interest him in the highest degree, and he had it repeated to him 3 times. He also wanted to be sure that the forest keeper knew that the professor and his daughter were going to dine in the laboratory, and how he had come to know it. When Monsieur Darzac had finished, I said, "The examination has not advanced the problem much." "It has put it back," said Monsieur Darzac. "It has thrown light upon it," said Rouletabille thoughtfully. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Zablicki. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 9. Reporter and Detective. The 3 of us went back towards the pavilion. At some distance from the building, the reporter made us stop and, pointing to a small clump of trees to the right of us, said, "That's where the murderer came from to get into the pavilion." As there were other patches of trees of the same sort between the great oaks, I asked why the murderer had chosen that one, rather than any of the others. Rouletabille answered me by pointing to the path which ran quite close to the thicket to the door of the pavilion. "That path is, as you see, topped with gravel," he said. "The man must have passed along it going to the pavilion, since no traces of his steps have been found on the soft ground. The man didn't have wings, he walked, but he walked on the gravel, which left no impression of his tread. The gravel has, in fact, been trodden by many other feet, since the path is the most direct way between the pavilion and the chateau. As to the thicket, made of the sort of shrubs that don't flourish in the rough season, laurels and fuchsias, it offered the murderer a sufficient hiding place until it was time for him to make his way to the pavilion. It was while hiding in that clump of trees that he saw Monsieur and Mademoiselle Stangerson, and then Daddy Jacques, leave the pavilion. Gravel has been spread very nearly up to the window of the pavilion. The footprints of a man, parallel with the wall, marks which we will examine presently and which I have already seen, prove that he only needed to make one stride to find himself in front of the vestibule window, left open by Daddy Jacques. The man drew himself up by his hands and entered the vestibule. "After all, it is very possible," I said. "After all what? After all what?" cried Rouletabille. I begged of him not to be angry, but he was too much irritated to listen to me, and declared, ironically, that he admired the prudent doubt with which certain people approached the most simple problems, risking nothing by saying, "That is so," or "That is not so." Their intelligence would have produced about the same result if nature had forgotten to furnish their brain-pan with a little grey matter. As I appeared vexed, my young friend took me by the arm and admitted that he had not meant that for me. He thought more of me than that. "If I did not reason as I do in regard to this gravel," he went on, "I should have to assume a balloon. My dear fellow, the science of the aerostation of dirigible balloons is not yet developed enough for me to consider it, and suppose that a murderer would drop from the clouds. So don't say a thing is possible when it could not be otherwise. We know now how the man entered by the window, and we also know the moment at which he entered, during the 5 o'clock walk of the professor and his daughter. The fact of the presence of the chambermaid, who had come to clean up the Yellow Room, in the laboratory, when Monsieur Stangerson and his daughter returned from their walk at 1:30, permits us to affirm that at 1:30 the murderer was not in the chamber under the bed, unless he was in collusion with the chambermaid. What do you say, Monsieur Darzac? Monsieur Darzac shook his head, and said he was sure of the chambermaid's fidelity, and that she was a thoroughly honest and devoted servant. Besides, he added, at 5 o'clock Monsieur Stangerson went into the room to fetch his daughter's hat. There is that also, said Rouletabille. That the man entered by the window at the time you say, I admit, I said, but why did he shut the window? It was an act which would necessarily draw the attention of those who had left it open. It may be the window was not shut at once, replied the young reporter. But if he did shut the window, it was because of the bend in the gravel path, a dozen yards from the pavilion, and on account of the 3 oaks that are growing at that spot. What do you mean by that? Asked Monsieur Darzac, who had followed us and listened with almost breathless attention to all that Rouletabille had said. I'll explain all to you later, monsieur, when I think the moment to be ripe for doing so. But I don't think I have anything of more importance to say on this affair, if my hypothesis is justified. And what is your hypothesis? You will never know, if it does not turn out to be the truth. It is of much too grave a nature to speak of it, so long as it continues to be only a hypothesis. Have you at least some idea as to who the murderer is? No, monsieur, I don't know who the murderer is. But don't be afraid, Monsieur Robert Darzac. I shall know. I could not but observe that Monsieur Darzac was deeply moved, and I suspected that Rouletabille's confident assertion was not pleasing to him. Why, I asked myself, if he was really afraid that the murderer should be discovered, was he helping the reporter to find him? My young friend seemed to have received the same impression, for he said, bluntly, Monsieur Darzac, don't you want me to find out who the murderer was? Oh, I should like to kill him with my own hand, cried Mademoiselle Stangerson's fiancé, with a vehemence that amazed me. I believe you, said Rouletabille gravely, but you have not answered my question. We were passing by the thicket, of which the young reporter had spoken to us a minute before. I entered it and pointed out evident traces of a man who had been hidden there. Rouletabille, once more, was right. Yes, yes, he said. We have to do with a thing of flesh and blood who uses the same means that we do. It'll all come out on those lines. Having said this, he asked me for the paper pattern of the footprint which he had given me to take care of, and applied it to a very clear footmark behind the thicket. "Aha!" he said, rising. I thought he was now going to trace back the track of the murderer's footmarks to the vestibule window, but he led us instead far to the left, saying that it was useless ferreting in the mud, and that he was sure now of the road taken by the murderer. He went along the wall to the hedge and dry ditch, over which he jumped. See, just in front of the little path leading to the lake, that was his nearest way to get out. How do you know he went to the lake? Because Frederick Larsen has not quitted the borders of it since this morning. There must be some important marks there. A few minutes later, we reached the lake. It was a little sheet of marshy water, surrounded by reeds, on which floated some dead water-lily leaves. The great Fred may have seen us approaching, but we probably interested him very little, for he took hardly any notice of us, and continued to be stirring with his cane something which we could not see. "Look," said Rouletabille, "here again are the footmarks of the escaping man. They skirt the lake here, and finally disappear just before this path, which leads to the high road to Epinay. The man continued his flight to Paris." "What makes you think that?" I asked, "since these footmarks are not continued on the path?" "What makes me think that? Why, these footprints, which I expected to find," he cried, pointing to the sharply outlined imprint of a neat boot. "See!" And he called to Frederick Larsen. "Monsieur Fred, these neat footprints seem to have been made since the discovery of the crime." "Yes, young man, yes, they have been carefully made," replied Fred, without raising his head. "You see, there are steps that come, and steps that go back." "And the man had a bicycle!" cried the reporter. Here, after looking at the marks of the bicycle, which followed, going and coming, the neat footprints, I thought I might intervene. "The bicycle explains the disappearance of the murderer's big footprints," I said. "The murderer, with his rough boots, mounted a bicycle. His accomplice, the wearer of the neat boots, had come to wait for him on the edge of the lake with the bicycle. It might be supposed that the murderer was working for the other." "No, no," replied Rouletabille with a strange smile. "I have expected to find these footmarks from the very beginning. These are not the footmarks of the murderer." "Then there were two." "No, there was but one, and he had no accomplice." Very good," cried Frederick Larsen. "Look," continued the young reporter, showing us the ground where it had been disturbed by the big and heavy heels. "The man seated himself there, and took off his hobnailed boots, which he had worn only for the purpose of misleading detection, and then, no doubt, taking them away with him, he stood up in his own boots and quietly and slowly regained the high road, holding his bicycle in his hand, for he could not venture to ride it on this rough path. That accounts for the lightness of the impression made by the wheels along it, in spite of the softness of the ground. If there had been a man on the bicycle, the wheels would have sunk deeply into the soil. No, there was but one man there, the murderer, on foot." "Bravo, bravo!" cried Fred again, and coming suddenly towards us, and planting himself in front of Monsieur Robert Darzac, he said to him, "If we had a bicycle here, we might demonstrate the correctness of the young man's reasoning, Monsieur Robert Darzac. Do you know whether there's one at the chateau?" "No," replied Monsieur Darzac, "there is not. I took mine 4 days ago to Paris, the last time I came to the chateau, before the crime." "That's a pity," replied Fred very coldly. Then turning to Rouletabille, he said, "If we go on at this rate, we'll both come to the same conclusion. Have you any idea as to how the murderer got away from the Yellow Room?" "Yes," said my young friend, "I have an idea." "So have I," said Fred, "and it must be the same as yours. There are no two ways of reasoning in this affair. I am waiting for the arrival of my chief before offering any explanation to the examining magistrate." "Ah, is the chief of the Sûreté coming?" "Yes, this afternoon. He is going to summon, before the magistrate, in the laboratory, all those who have played any part in this tragedy. It will be very interesting. It is a pity you won't be able to be present." "I shall be present," said Rouletabille confidently. "Really, you are an extraordinary fellow, for your age," replied the detective in a tone not wholly free from irony. "You'd make a wonderful detective, if you had a little more method, if you didn't follow your instincts and that bump on your forehead. As I have already several times observed, Monsieur Rouletabille, you reason too much. you do not allow yourself to be guided by what you have seen. What do you say to the handkerchief full of blood, and the red mark of the hand on the wall? You have seen the stain on the wall, but I have only seen the handkerchief." "Bah!" cried Rouletabille. "The murderer was wounded in the hand by Mademoiselle Stangerson's revolver." "Ah, a simply instinctive observation. Take care. You are becoming too strictly logical, Monsieur Rouletabille. Logic will upset you if you use it indiscriminately. You are right when you say that Mademoiselle Stangerson fired her revolver, but you are wrong when you say that she wounded the murderer in the hand." "I am sure of it!" cried Rouletabille. Fred, imperturbable, interrupted him. "Defective observation, defective observation. The examination of the handkerchief, the numberless little round scarlet stains, the impression of drops which I found in the tracks of the footprints at the moment when they were made on the floor, proved to me that the murderer was not wounded at all. Monsieur Rouletabille, the murderer bled at the nose." The great Fred spoke quite seriously. However, I could not refrain from uttering an exclamation. The reporter looked gravely at Fred, who looked gravely at him. And Fred immediately concluded, "The man allowed the blood to flow into his hand and handkerchief, and dried his hand on the wall. The fact is highly important," he added, "because there is no need of his being wounded in the hand for him to be the murderer." Rouletabille seemed to be thinking deeply. After a moment, he said, "There is something, Monsieur Frederick Larsan, much graver than the misuse of logic, the disposition of mind in some detectives which makes them, in perfect good faith, twist logic to the necessities of their preconceived ideas. You already have your idea about the murderer, Monsieur Fred. Don't deny it. And your theory demands that the murderer should not have been wounded in the hand. Otherwise, it comes to nothing. And you have searched and have found something else. It's dangerous, very dangerous, Monsieur Fred, to go from a preconceived idea to find the proofs to fit it. That method may leave you far astray. Beware of judicial error, Monsieur Fred. It will trip you up." And laughing a little, in a slightly bantering tone, his hands in his pockets, Rouletabille fixed his cunning eyes on the great Fred. Frederick Larsan silently contemplated the young reporter, who pretended to be as wise as himself. Shrugging his shoulders, he bowed to us and moved quickly away, hitting the stones on his path with his stout cane. Rouletabille watched his retreat and then turned towards us, his face joyous and triumphant. "I shall beat him!" he cried. "I shall beat the great Fred, clever as he is. I shall beat them all!" And he danced a double shuffle. Suddenly he stopped. My eyes followed his gaze. They were fixed on Monsieur Robert Darzac, who was looking anxiously at the impression left by his feet side by side with the elegant footmarks. There was not a particle of difference between them. We thought he was about to faint. His eyes, bulging with terror, avoided us, while his right hand, with a spasmodic movement, twitched at the beard that covered his honest, gentle, and now despairing face. At length, regaining his self-possession, he bowed to us, and remarking in a changed voice that he was obliged to return to the chateau, and left us. "The deuce!" exclaimed Rouletabille. He also appeared to be deeply concerned. From his pocket-book he took a piece of white paper, as I had seen him do before, and with his scissors cut out the shape of the neat boot marks that were on the ground. Then he fitted the new paper pattern with the one he had previously made. The two were exactly alike. Rising, Rouletabille exclaimed again, "The deuce!" Presently he added, "Yet I believe Monsieur Robert Darzac to be an honest man." He then led me on the road to the Donjon Inn, which we could see on the highway, by the side of a small clump of trees. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Zablicki. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 10. We Shall Have to Eat Red Meat Now. The Donjon Inn was of no imposing appearance, but I liked these buildings with their rafters blackened with age and the smoke of their hearths, these inns of the coaching days, crumbling erections that will soon exist in the memory only. They belong to the bygone days. They are linked with history. They make us think of the road, of those days when highwaymen rode. I saw at once that the Donjon Inn was at least 2 centuries old, perhaps older. Under its signboard, over the threshold, a man with a crabbed-looking face was standing, seemingly plunged in unpleasant thought, if the wrinkles on his forehead and the knitting of his brows were any indication. When we were close to him, he deigned to see us and asked us, in a tone anything but engaging, whether we wanted anything. He was, no doubt, the not very amiable landlord of this charming dwelling-place. As we expressed a hope that he would be good enough to furnish us with a breakfast, he assured us that he had no provisions, regarding us, as he said this, with a look that was unmistakably suspicious. "You may take us in," Rouletabille said to him. "We're not policemen." "I'm not afraid of the police. I'm not afraid of anyone," replied the man. I had made my friend understand by a sign that we should do better not to insist, but being determined to enter the inn, he slipped by the man on the doorstep and was in the common room. "Come on," he said. "It is very comfortable here." A good fire was blazing in the chimney, and we held our hands to the warmth it sent out. It was a morning in which the approach of winter was unmistakable. The room was a tolerably large one, furnished with 2 heavy tables, some stools, a counter decorated with rows of bottles of syrup and alcohol. 3 windows looked out onto the road. A colored advertisement lauded the many merits of a new vermouth. On the mantelpiece was arrayed the innkeeper's collection of figured earthenware pots and stone jugs. "That's a fine fire for roasting a chicken," said Rouletabille. "We have no chicken, not even a wretched rabbit," said the landlord. "I know," said my friend slowly. "I know. We shall have to eat red meat, now." I confess I did not in the least understand what Rouletabille meant by what he had said, but the landlord, as soon as he heard the words, uttered an oath, which he at once stifled, and placed himself at our orders, as obediently as Monsieur Robert Darzac had done, when he heard Rouletabille's prophetic sentence, "The presbytery has lost nothing of its charm, nor the garden its brightness." Certainly my friend knew how to make people understand him by the use of wholly incomprehensible phrases. I observed as much to him, but he merely smiled. I should have proposed that he give me some explanation, but he put a finger to his lips, which evidently signified that he had not only determined not to speak, but also enjoined silence on my part. Meantime, the man had pushed open a little side door and called to somebody to bring him 6 eggs and a piece of beefsteak. The commission was quickly executed by a strongly built young woman with beautiful blonde hair and large, handsome eyes, who regarded us with curiosity. The innkeeper said to her roughly, "Get out, and if the green man comes, don't let me see him." She disappeared. Rouletabille took the eggs, which had been brought to him in a bowl, and the meat, which was on a dish, placed all carefully beside him in the chimney, unhooked a frying-pan and a gridiron, and began to beat up our omelette before proceeding to grill our beefsteak. He then ordered 2 bottles of cider, and seemed to take as little notice of our host as our host did of him. The landlord let us do our own cooking, and set our table near one of the windows. Suddenly I heard him mutter, "Ah, there he is." His face had changed, expressing fierce hatred. He went and glued himself to one of the windows, watching the road. There was no need for me to draw Rouletabille's attention. He had already left our omelette and had joined the landlord at the window. I went with him. A man dressed entirely in green velvet, his head covered with a huntsman's cap of the same color, was advancing leisurely, lighting a pipe as he walked. He carried a fowling piece slung at his back. His movements displayed an almost aristocratic ease. He wore eyeglasses, and appeared to be about 45 years of age. His hair, as well as his mustache, was salt gray. He was remarkably handsome. As he passed near the inn he hesitated, as if asking himself whether or no he should enter it, gave a glance towards us, took a few whiffs at his pipe, and then resumed his walk at the same nonchalant pace. Rouletabille and I looked at our host. His flashing eyes, his clenched hands, his trembling lips told us of the tumultuous feelings by which he was being agitated. "He has done well not to come in here today," he hissed. "Who is that man?" asked Rouletabille, returning to his omelette. "The Green Man," growled the innkeeper. "Don't you know him? Then all the better for you. He is not an acquaintance to make. Well, he's Monsieur Stangerson's forest keeper." "You don't like him very much?" asked the reporter, pouring his omelette into the frying pan. "Nobody likes him, monsieur. He's an upstart who must once have had a fortune of his own, and he forgives nobody because in order to live he has been compelled to become a servant. A keeper is as much a servant as any other, isn't he? Upon my word, one would say that he is the master of the Glandier, and that all the land and woods belong to him. He'll not let a poor creature eat a morsel of bread on the grass. His grass." "Does he often come here?" "Too often. But I've made him understand that his face doesn't please me, and for a month past he hasn't been here. The Donjon Inn has never existed for him. He hasn't had time. Been too much engaged in paying court to the landlady of the Three Lilies at Saint Michel. A bad fellow. There isn't an honest man who can bear him. Why, the concierges of the chateau would turn their eyes away from a picture of him." "The concierges of the chateau are honest people, then?" "Yes, they are, as true as my name's Matthew, monsieur. I believe them to be honest." "Yet they've been arrested." "What does that prove? But I don't want to mix myself up in other people's affairs." "And what do you think of the murder?" "Of the murder of poor Mademoiselle Stangerson? A good girl, much loved everywhere in the country. That's what I think of it. And many things besides, but that's nobody's business." "Not even mine?" insisted Rouletabille. The innkeeper looked at him sideways and said gruffly, "Not even yours." The omelette ready, we sat down at table and were silently eating, when the door was pushed open and an old woman, dressed in rags, leaning on a stick, her head doddering, her white hair hanging loosely over her wrinkled forehead, appeared on the threshold. "Ah, there you are, Mother Angenoux. It's long since we saw you last," said our host. "I have been ill, very nearly dying," said the old woman. "If ever you should have any scraps for the bête de bon Dieu." And she entered, followed by a cat, larger than any I had ever believed could exist. The beast looked at us, and gave so hopeless a meow that I shuddered. I had never heard so lugubrious a cry. As if drawn by the cat's cry, a man followed the old woman in. It was the Green Man. He saluted by raising his hand to his cap, and seated himself at a table near to ours. "A glass of cider, Daddy Matthew," he said. As the Green Man entered, Daddy Matthew had started violently, but visibly mastering himself, he said, "I've no more cider. I served the last bottles to these gentlemen." "Then give me a glass of white wine," said the Green Man, without showing the least surprise. "I've no more white wine. No more anything," said Daddy Matthew surlily. "How's Madame Matthew?" "Quite well, thank you." So the young woman with the large, tender eyes whom we had just seen was the wife of this repugnant and brutal rustic, whose jealousy seemed to emphasize his physical ugliness. Slamming the door behind him, the innkeeper left the room. Mother Angenoux was still standing, leaning on her stick, the cat at her feet. "You've been ill, Mother Angenoux. Is that why we have not seen you for the last week?" asked the Green Man. "Yes, Monsieur Keeper. I have been able to get up but 3 times, to go to pray to Sainte Geneviève, our good patroness, and the rest of the time I have been lying on my bed. There was no one to care for me but the bête de bon Dieu." "Did she not leave you?" "Neither by day nor by night." "Are you sure of that?" "As I am of paradise." "Then how was it, Madame Angenoux, that all through the night of the murder nothing but the cry of the bête de bon Dieu was heard?" Mother Angenoux planted herself in front of the forest keeper and struck the floor with her stick. "I don't know anything about it," she said. "But shall I tell you something? There are no two cats in the world that cry like that. Well, on the night of the murder, I also heard the cry of the Bête de bon Dieu outside, and yet she was on my knees, and did not mew once, I swear. I crossed myself when I heard that, as if I had heard the devil. I looked at the keeper when he put the last question, and I am much mistaken if I did not detect an evil smile on his lips. At that moment the noise of loud quarrelling reached us. We even thought we heard a dull sound of blows, as if someone was being beaten. The green man quickly rose and hurried to the door by the side of the fireplace, but it was opened by the landlord, who appeared and said to the keeper, "Don't alarm yourself, monsieur. It is my wife. She has the toothache." And he laughed. "Here, Mother Angenoux, here are some scraps for your cat." He held out a packet to the old woman, who took it eagerly and went out by the door, closely followed by her cat. "Then you won't serve me?" asked the green man. Daddy Matthew's face was placid, and no longer retained its expression of hatred. "I've nothing for you, nothing for you. Take yourself off." The green man quietly refilled his pipe, lit it, bowed to us, and went out. No sooner was he over the threshold than Daddy Matthew slammed the door after him, and turning towards us with eyes bloodshot and frothing at the mouth, he hissed to us, shaking his clenched fist at the door he had just shut on the man he evidently hated. "I don't know who you are who tell me we shall have to eat red meat now, but if it will interest you to know it, that man is the murderer." With which words Daddy Matthew immediately left us. Rouletabille returned towards the fireplace and said, "Now we'll grill our steak. How do you like the cider? It's a little tart, but I like it." We saw no more of Daddy Matthew that day, and absolute silence reigned in the inn when we left it, after placing 5 francs on the table in payment for our feast. Rouletabille at once set off on a 3-mile walk round Professor Stangerson's estate. He halted for some 10 minutes at the corner of a narrow road, black with soot, near to some charcoal burners' huts in the forest of Saint-Geneviève, which touches on the road from Épinay to Corbeil, to tell me that the murderer had certainly passed that way, before entering the grounds and concealing himself in the little clump of trees. "You don't think, then, that the keeper knows anything of it?" I asked. "We shall see that later," he replied. "For the present, I'm not interested in what the landlord said about the man. The landlord hates him. I didn't take you to breakfast at the Donjon Inn for the sake of the green man." Then Rouletabille with great precaution glided, followed by me, towards the little building, which, standing near the park gate, served for the home of the concierges, who had been arrested that morning. With the skill of an acrobat, he got into the lodge by an upper window, which had been left open, and returned 10 minutes later. He said only, "Ah," a word which, in his mouth, signified many things. We were about to take the road leading to the chateau, when a considerable stir at the park gate attracted our attention. A carriage had arrived, and some people had come out from the chateau to meet it. Rouletabille pointed out to me a gentleman who descended from it. "That's the chief of the Sûreté," he said. "Now we shall see what Frederick Larsan has up his sleeve, and whether he is so much cleverer than anybody else." The carriage of the chief of the Sûreté was followed by 3 other vehicles containing reporters, who were also desirous of entering the park. But 2 gendarmes stationed at the gate had evidently received orders to refuse admission to anybody. The chief of the Sûreté calmed their impatience by undertaking to furnish to the press, that evening, all the information he could give that would not interfere with the judicial inquiry. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Gloria Zablicki, Floral Park, New York.